In this video, we're going to talk about the various market structures in which firms may operate. The basic economic models of markets that we'll be using are perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. Let's briefly talk about each one of those. A perfectly competitive market is an extreme type of market in which there's very many firms producing identical products. In fact, there are so many buyers and sellers that no individual buyer or seller is large enough to affect the market price. What happens in these markets is the interaction of demand and supply will determine the price, and then each individual buyer and seller faces that market price. They're not able to influence that. This is an extreme market condition that we virtually never see. The closest we come to this is in the market for agricultural products. There are very few buyers that are big enough to influence the market price, and there's very few sellers that are big enough to influence the market price. For example, take the market for wheat. There are so many farmers out there producing wheat that no individual farmer is big enough for their supply of wheat to influence what the price of wheat will be. So each individual farmer has to take the price of wheat as given. Similarly, each individual buyer is too small to be able to influence the market price of wheat. Even in agriculture, there are some firms, for example, some cereal companies, that may be big enough to influence the price of some agricultural products. Similarly, Coca-Cola and Pepsi are large enough to be able to influence the price of sugar. But this is about as close as we get. We see many more firms that fit into the description of monopolistic competition. A monopolistically competitive market is characterized by many firms who are all producing products that are similar but not identical to those of other firms. So each firm is engaged in something we call product differentiation. They're each trying to make their own product somewhat unique. To the extent to which firms are able to differentiate their products from those of other firms, the demand curve facing them is downward sloping. Many of the markets that you operate in, particularly small businesses, tend to be operating in monopolistically competitive markets, particularly in larger communities and larger cities. For example, the restaurant industry in New York City is probably best characterized as monopolistically competitive. There are thousands of individual restaurants in New York, and each one of those firms tries to differentiate their product. They try to use a different decor, they have different menus, they have different recipes, they try to create a different ambiance, and as a result, they can raise their price without losing all their customers. In a competitive market, on the other hand, if any firm tried to charge a higher price for a product that everyone perceives as identical, no one would buy it. They'd also have no reason to charge a lower price. But in monopolistically competitive markets, firms are able to raise their prices without losing all their customers because some people have a strong preference for the particular product that that company is offering. So in addition to restaurants, we see this in bars, we see this in many types of clothing, many types of foods, and many of the other products that we buy, where there are many firms producing similar but not identical products. Another type of market that we observe quite often is an oligopoly. An oligopoly market is characterized by a small number of firms that produce most of the output in the industry. The steel industry is an example of an oligopoly industry. The cola beverage market is an oligopoly. Even though there's many firms producing cola beverages, Coke and Pepsi produce the vast majority of all the cola beverages out there. Many manufactured goods are produced in oligopoly markets. The products they produce could be identical or they could be similar. For example, in the market for steel, there's a high level of standardization because we have international standards defining various types of steel, I-beams, rolled specialty steel, and so forth. So all the steel produced shares the same basic characteristics, no matter which manufacturer. In other oligopolies, such as the auto industry or the market for household appliances, firms are producing similar but somewhat different products or differentiated products. Because there's a small number of firms, this market, and we'll see this in more detail a bit later in the course, is characterized by a high degree of mutual interdependence. When a firm changes its price, it doesn't really know how that's going to affect its sales, because it's going to depend to a large extent on what rival firms do. In the fast food industry, if McDonald's were to lower the price of their Big Macs, The effect on their sales and the profits will depend on what Burger King, Wendy's, and other fast food restaurants do in response. So we see many oligopoly markets out there, but they're all characterized by this interdependence. At the other extreme, we have the market model of monopoly. A monopoly is characterized by one firm that produces all the output, and the output it produces has no close substitutes. So, for example, in a given community, there may be only one company that is distributing electricity or natural gas. That's an example of a monopoly. It turns out to be a regulated monopoly, and we'll talk about that in more detail a bit later. While you may be able to buy the electricity from different companies, you have to pay for the distribution through the local utility that has been granted a monopoly franchise. It wouldn't be efficient to have multiple power lines running down every street, for example. That also tends to be true of cable services that are provided by wires or fiber in a given community. Typically, only one firm is able to sell that. And because there's only one firm in this market, the firm faces the entire downward sloping market demand curve. In practice, we don't observe any pure monopolies, just as we don't observe any perfectly competitive markets. Most firms will operate in either a monopolistically competitive or an oligopoly market. However, we're going to initially focus our attention at the two extremes because they're a little bit simpler to analyze. Then we'll turn our attention to the somewhat more challenging cases of monopolistic competition and oligopoly.